do this evening then is to argue for a link between the kinds of work that people perform under a post-industrial dispensation on the one hand, and the oddly potent coupling of religious family values and neoliberal economics on the other hand. So the kinds of work and the sort of ideological underpinnings of it. I'll look at the high and low ends of post-industrial work, which I would characterize as service and finance, and then, if time permits, consider a political development that I think responds to both of those. I think seeing these together opens up some new ways to conceive of the relationship between religious revival, sexual morality, and our current economic logic. And so when you get to stand up in front of people and say, I'm going to talk about sex, money, and religion, you at least feel like you've got a fighting chance. In order to consider these issues together, it helps to have some basic context on the table. And I've used in this talk the term post-industrial from, of course, Daniel Bell's 1973, The Coming of Post-Industrial Society, which heralded the advent of a knowledge-based economy. You know what? I'm going to assume that coming from an oral culture, I'm capable of projecting. Is that going to work for y'all? Excellent. You'll soon regret that. Which heralded the advent of a knowledge-based economy as a distinct form of industrial modernity. In some circles, the same distinction travels under the names Fordism and post-Fordism, if that's a more familiar terminology for you, a formula that allows us to concretize the differences that we mean. In this schema, then, the period of Fordism, after the Ford Motor Company, of course, lasted from about 1914 to about 1973 and was characterized by mass production and mass consumption of consumer durables, planned power sharing on the part of big business, big government, and big labor, and social standardization through bureaucratic institutions, nuclear families, and a homogenizing nationalism. Post-Fordism, then, the contrasting period, the one we're more interested in, the period since about 1973, relied in this schema increasingly on niche production and marketing of ever more disposable items, a retreat from the state regulation and safety nets that had stabilized the boom and bust business cycles, highly polarized labor markets and flexible, insecure working arrangements, an explosive acceleration of circulating credit and investment capital, and a social and cultural emphasis on difference. The spiritual reactions that interest me are those then that responded to this new order after about 1973, and we can argue about that time point if you prefer. There are several ways to focus in on the economic changes that I think have produced a new organization of spirituality. Sociologist Greta Krippner contrasts the framework of post-industrialism or post-Fordism to that of financialization. The framework of post-industry, she says, answers the question of what tasks are performed or what goods are produced. And these are familiar questions and easy to get our minds around. Whereas the narrative of financialization responds to the question, where are profits produced? So equally valid questions, but they get us to different entry points. All three of these questions, I think, are relevant to the religious revival and the political realignment of the same era. And I'll address them in order before turning to this development that I think unites all three. So to take up this question, first, what tasks are performed in a post-industrial society? Does that get us to something meaningful for considering people's religious lives, spiritual lives? And my own interest was originally in the first of these issues. What tasks are performed under post-Fordism? What do people do all day? And how does that affect their spiritual lives, their sense of morality, their ideology? Under Fordism, after all, there were distinct cultural and religious responses to the shock of urban factory life. And expressions of this encounter ranged from jazz and cubism to prohibition, fundamentalism, and the Nation of Islam. We could argue about any of those if you care to push me. Under post-Fordism, our shared experience of work is largely of service. Not making things in factories, but tending to people in schools, in hospitals, restaurants, stores, daycare centers, universities, prisons, call centers, cyberspace. Usually our work involves trying to meet someone else's needs. Already by 1970, almost 2/3 of working Americans were employed in service occupations, and by 1983, the service sector itself, as a sector of the economy, overtook manufacturing. In 2001, this changing of the guard was made official when Fortune magazine reported that Walmart a lowly service provider, was now the largest corporation on the planet. So Walmart seemed like a likely candidate for examining the lived experience of post-Fordism if you happen to be looking for a dissertation topic around 2001. And so that's where I got to explore one vigorous spiritual response to the rise of service work, namely family values, or the evangelical antipathy to non-reproductive sex that underwrote the rise of the new Christian right. Okay, so a particular work environment and a particular industry and economic organization turned out to be a really rich container of a very particular spiritual response. This antipathy between non-reproductive sex and Christian conservatism has achieved that ultimate ideological goal of appearing so self-evident as to pass unexamined. We assume that those two are in opposition. In the culture war's interpretation of the conservative ascendancy, after all, the triumph of free market economics was enabled over 2 generations by the cynical manipulation of emotional, irrational religious prejudices. I'm sure you recognize this argument, and I'm offering it as one that I strongly feel is in error, largely. By periodically, however, it goes thus. By periodically hollering abortion or homosexual agenda, this explanation posits, the godless free marketeers duped the folks in the pews into dismantling their own New Deal protections, forcing American wealth disparities back to 19th century levels and greasing the skids for the wholesale offloading of middle-class jobs. As Thomas Frank put it in a definitive popular formulation, the rise of the new Christian right was the spectacle of a French Revolution in reverse, one in which the sans-culottes poured down the street demanding more power to the aristocracy. So this was kind of the parody of the rise of the new Christian right by people who were not themselves, I think, particularly sympathetic to a religious worldview. But this approach did not actually probe the content of the beliefs that it caricatured. Why was Christian opposition to abortion and homosexuality so effective as an enabler of free market economic policies in this period? That's not automatically clear. Why were evangelicals available for mobilization around these issues specifically at that moment? How did the values voters behind deregulation, privatization, and globalization come to see non-reproductive sex as the central threat to America? In order to think constructively about this, I want to just give us a little vignette from the culture wars, from the moment when these particular issues around sexuality became so prominent. And you have to take my word for it that they were not prior to this moment. They were not, applauded in religious circles, but they were not the focal point for public engagement. In 1979, Christian surgeon and later U.S. Surgeon General C. Everett Koop teamed up with the prolific anti-abortion crusader Francis Schaeffer to produce Whatever Happened to the Human Race. Under this title, a book, a 5-part video sequence, and a traveling workshop laid out the winning argument against abortion for Christians who had previously shown little formal concern. The Southern Baptist Convention, I think, was mildly pro-choice prior to this point. The argument went like this. Rational Enlightenment values, or secular humanism in the author's argot, could not distinguish between vulnerable, unproductive, non-contributing members of the human race and any other drag on maximum efficiency, i.e., by looking at the world through this mechanistic lens, anything that slowed down production, that made life more inefficient, including non-productive people, were expendable, says this argument. Most forcefully, the image of absolutely vulnerable human life tossed out as refuse has dramatically haunted conservative Christianity since the mid-1970s, as Susan Friend Harding has made clear in her work. Jerry Falwell's account of his awakening to an active pro-life position invoked a dumpster in Los Angeles, overflowing with the dismembered remains of 1,700 fetal bodies, and a trash incinerator in Wichita, sending up hundreds more like the victims of Auschwitz. Here is a poignant link, I think, between the emotional content of family values and the historically specific circumstances in which they gained purchase. During these same years, after all, the post-industrial economy's accelerated drive to render people functionally obsolete was figured in the imagery of the political left as the dispossessed, the army of the unemployed, right? There is concern on both sides of this divide with what do you do with people when technological change and reorganized production makes them essentially obsolete. But its mirror image on the right was expressed as horror at the potential loss of meaning in human reproduction. The dispossessed in this cosmology were the children unconceived or unborn because of their economic superfluity. Here, hence the emphasis on abortion as the callous strategy of ambitious, quote, career women who could not be inconvenienced, or on homosexuals as an affluent population that selfishly consumes without reproducing, as Anne Pellegrini argues elsewhere. And this is a link, I think, between the rise of family values Christianity centered on those issues and the experience of post-industrial work, the experience of service, of care and attention to other people rather than to objects. Both the original industrial labor mythos, the one that posits a labor hero who's going to come over the horizon with his shirt off and, you know, save us as a hero of labor, both that imagery and this liberal sex-neutral neutral corrective, the one that said, no, now we're all going to get to be lawyers. Now we're going to assume that everyone's alike, and we're just going to remove the barriers of sex to entry into men's jobs. Both of those actually devalued women's skills, work, and personal priorities. Factories, after all, ignored the reproductive work of the home, and liberal feminism tackled the barriers that kept women from men's jobs without managing to redefine what a job was, to take into account all that labor that had never actually been accounted for. The post-industrial solution was to lionize women's contribution and indeed to raise it to the status of managerial gospel. That if service suddenly becomes the key work category, it becomes possible, if you're thus inclined, to turn it into a much more important cultural touchstone. Drawing on an idealized agrarian family model that resonated with the new economy's Sunbelt recruits, I argue that the male manager at a place like Walmart figured his authority as servant leadership. And according to this cosmology, I don't want to get too deep into this, men earn their power through their superior ability to serve, you know, which is a novel way to talk about men in the workplace, is that now suddenly what makes them fit to run a workplace is in fact that they're really good at what we now think of as women's work. And that reversal was something that caught my attention. That was therefore the starting point for trying to branch into additional aspects of the spiritual landscape of post-Fordism, of post-industrial society. If the tasks of social reproduction are the work of post-Fordism, if all that teaching and caring and healing is what people are doing, then reproduction, not surprisingly, becomes a cultural and religious touchstone the same way that production did for the factory era. So if we can start from that terrain, if you can at least give me that as a consideration, I want to look then at where we might be able to go from that. Because to take this contrasting question, Greta Krippner's Where Are Profits Produced? We come to a totally different terrain of work. This is also, I think, a promising avenue for religious analysis of post-industrial work. While service is the leading employment sector, most people who have jobs in the post-industrial economy work at service, nonetheless, the big money has actually been made in the sector called FIRE, which is oddly evocative. It stands for finance, insurance, and real estate, that kind of ethereal part of the economy that has been so much in the news, whether based in the Bank of America, a Bear Stearns, or in the finance departments of more traditional companies like GE or Walmart itself. Even companies that we think of as doing something totally different, like making refrigerators or selling DVDs at Christmas time, are actually themselves finance companies now. In this view, the striking departure of the 1970s was the shift from production and trade to the non-productive circulation of investment capital. We're getting even further away from the actual creation of value. This shift from a real to a virtual economy was enabled in stages, as many people here will know, by changes like the end of the gold standard in 1971, the invention of new instruments for securitization in the early 1970s, and the dismantling of national capital controls by the end of the decade, as well as ongoing mergers, the popularizing of money market accounts, and successive waves of financial deregulation that effectively repealed the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933. So that after a generation of this restructuring, for every dollar traded in actual goods and services combined, $9 was being gambled on short-term changes in foreign exchange markets. Okay, this is a significant change. I want to test with you then the idea that finance, like service, could be a pivotal issue for the renegotiation of family values. The deregulated financial industries that brought us the recent crisis, the recent unpleasantness, are culturally entangled in reproductive morality. In the new millennium, Americans have been quick to attribute our declining savings rate and skyrocketing debt-to-income ratio as a byproduct of our supersized self-indulgence. Margaret Atwood, for example, contrasts the thrift of her Depression-era parents with the, quote, shopaholic binges that produce dramatic remorse, penance, and born-again frugality on reality debt shows, where Dave Ramsey and a pair of scissors taken to your credit card can free you from the curse of Proverbs 22:7, the rich rule over the poor, and the borrower is the slave of the lender. And this is an area that I've been working on for a different book project that I think is actually incredibly psychologically and emotionally engaging. That this is no joke. You might laugh at the structure in which these kinds of changes take place, but none of us, I think, in 2013 can feel free from the power of debt and its ability to actually make the borrower a slave of the lender. This rueful anatomy of debt thus assigns the moral burden to the debtor. But over the last generation, actually, debt has been thoroughly uncoupled from the concept of payback. The least valuable debt is the one that is promptly repaid. The typical client for a payday loan, for example, must flip a 2-week loan 8 times before managing to pay it off, to the tune of $793 for a $300 advance. You don't want that person to be a responsible borrower. If people followed those rules, that entire industry would go under. Several years before the 2008 crisis, a vice president of Citigroup invited Elizabeth Warren, then a humble professor at the Harvard Law School, now senator from Massachusetts, of course, to explain to the financial services conglomerate how best to decrease their losses from, quote, charge-offs, which is the industry term for customers who have stopped paying their credit card bills. As Warren recounts in the documentary Maxed Out, she accordingly put together a 2-day seminar for Citigroup executives that boiled down to a simple point. If they'd stop making loans to people who clearly could not repay them, they could instantly cut their charge-off losses by half. That was not an option, replied the ranking executive in the room. Quote, if we cut out those people, we're cutting at the heart of our profits. That's where we make all our money. A vice president of MasterCard defined, quote, a preferred customer as one, quote, willing to make minimum monthly payments forever. In this diabolical variation on just desserts, the original principle becomes simply a wedge for the real moneymakers. Late fees for a check received at 2 p.m. rather than 9 a.m., double cycle billing, which allows a company to charge interest on a loan already paid off, subprime mortgages peddled door to door to people who would qualify for better rates, with a credit card insurance premium tacked on every month. The mortgage brokers who wrote NINA loans, and I'm sure you know it stands for no income, no assets, words that you do not expect to see attached to the word loan, essentially bet that somehow the ability to repay with interest could be conjured out of thin air by people with no resources. Is it any wonder, write Jean and John Komaroff, that around the world, the eclipse of production by finance has seen the rise of, quote, occult economies, an explosion in zombie conjuring, witchcraft, Ponzi schemes, fortune-telling, and the prosperity gospel. If, in fact, the best way to make money is essentially witchcraft, it's not surprising, they suggest, that people's spiritual lives reflect this. When the neoliberal deregulation of the 1970s enabled new asset-backed securities, consumer debt became an end in itself, an infinitely fungible currency in its own right, and one increasingly free of international borders. Its sudden hyper-profitability sucked capital from existing channels into consumer credit. The structures of capitalism, Louis Hyman argues in his Debtor Nation, changed more than the thriftiness of consumers. This was not a moral failing on the part of American consumers. It was a structural shift, and people's borrowing behavior essentially stayed the same. The borrowers of the 1970s, 80s were largely replicating the credit habits of the greatest generation. But they did so under new conditions: stagnating wages, falling purchasing power, shrinking social services, and rising unemployment. As stable forms of production and exchange were replaced by international arbitrage, the link between debt and sorcery was evident to observers around the world. 23 dead Ohioans were issued mortgages, and more than $1 billion was wagered on the deaths of total strangers through life insurance policies. States turned to casinos for jobs and tax revenue, and lotteries for educational funding. And the magical new currencies created by deregulation, collateralized debt obligations and their ghostly ilk, opened up whole new realms of speculative investment. With $70 trillion restlessly roaming the globe for investment opportunities in the new millennium, more money was spent on a sophisticated form of gambling than on all productive goods and services. Versions of the shock therapy, a deliberate, dramatic contraction of the money supply, have been repeatedly deployed since the 1970s to herd debtor nations towards a neoliberal utopia of free markets. National revenues formerly intended for schools or sewers are pledged first to interest payments to Chase. For every dollar spent on aid to the poorest countries, $1.30 came back north in debt servicing. Debt, therefore, is not about timely balance, but about permanent imbalance. And I want to argue then that there is also this reproductive morality tale behind this structural shift that helps make sense of the incredible prominence of reproductive issues in our political landscape over this period. Our unprecedented levels of household indebtedness have been overwhelmingly a function of discretionary spending. Okay, when we think of this as an explosion in consumerism, we're actually missing where the action really was. Since the end of the long American post-war boom, relatively fixed expenses like tuition, transportation, healthcare, insurance, and housing have doubled, tripled, even quintupled, while prices on clothes and groceries have steadily decreased. An analysis of federal data on consumption showed that compared with the typical family from the early 1970s, one in the new millennium actually had less discretionary income left over after paying fixed expenses. And this despite having added the wife's earnings to the household in the interim. Okay, so we essentially liquidated an entire reserve army of labor, namely housewives, turned them into income generators, and still the average family lost discretionary spending power because the fixed expenses grew so shockingly. Even the burgeoning mortgage debt was more a hidden education tax than an orgy of McMansion envy. We think of that as like, oh my God, people just couldn't wait to have the huge house in the suburbs, but of course that has everything to do with school districts. Housing prices for families with children increased more than 3 times faster than those for childless people, driven by a bidding war over desirable school districts in a country that continues to apportion education by zip code. In fact, even as Americans owed 100% of GDP in individual debt in 2008, the real Faustian bargain is not an enjoy now, pay later scheme for some kind of glitzy short-term junk. The truth is actually much scarier and points toward a different set of cultural and theological references. The dividing line between solvency and insolvency, it turns out, is not consumption, but reproduction. The most certain route to financial disaster is having a child. This hidden narrative behind debt actually resurrects the biblical and philosophical roots of its suspect status. In a pastoral or agricultural economy, the problem with loaning at interest lies in the literal sterility of finance. That is what is perverse and suspect about it, is that interest perverts the natural sterility of money. Use, reasons Aristotle in the Politics, is the proper measure of value. Something is valuable if you have a use for it. Production or barter practiced for provisioning a household, he argues, is natural, since it is subject to natural limits. You can trade wheat for wine as a convenience, but there will be a ceiling on the amount of either that your household can consume. There is going to be a natural limit to your consumption under these conditions. Exchange beyond those limits, however, perverts the means and makes it into an end. And it's this reasoning that underlies some of the Thomist and then Neo-Thomist reasoning that we can talk about. In the scholastic tradition that embraced Aristotle's distinction, writes anthropologist Michael Taussig, the perversity of lending it interest is thus that it takes a thing fundamentally sterile and unreal and allows it to behave as though it were real, natural, and reproductive. As suspicious as Aristotle is of commerce generally, he thus holds usury to be, quote, of all modes of acquisition, the most unnatural. For interest may be called, quote, currency the son of currency, an outrage to nature herself. Thus, I would argue sexual sin is actually central to the figure of the miser in Western narratives. Ebenezer Scrooge and his tight-fisted ilk are perverse in their sterility. Like the homosexual and the aborting mother, they selfishly reject reproduction, this logic goes, with its attendant costs and limits, and instead make barren metal breed. Their refusal to increase naturally underwrites their success at increasing unnaturally. From Silas Marner to Scrooge McDuck, the usurer gains his fortune by rejecting his natural function, or being rejected by it, as Shylock is by his daughter Jessica. Crimes against nature in this cosmology could well include finance. Addressing the post-industrial order from these two perspectives, I think, the task of service on the one hand and the profit generator of finance on the other, thus gives us purchase on the spiritual and religious landscape of the last 40 years. I am not going to be able to elaborate too fully on where I think this has taken us, but I want to take a quick stab at how some of this logic has underwritten the rapprochement between evangelicals and Catholics at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century. I'm just going to go commando here. Where this has taken me recently that I want to test with you is simply to take a long view of this politically productive marriage of Christian conservative white evangelicals on the one hand and Catholics on the other. And this is a political problem because Catholic social thought has been held to be so inimical to some of the neoliberal and free market impulses coming out of evangelicalism. And so it's kind of a conundrum. It's certainly been a political issue in play for people on multiple points on the political spectrum. Can, in fact, Catholic social teaching be, as it were, overcome by Catholic sexual conservatism in favor of an enlarged coalition of Christian conservatism united around antipathy to non-reproductive sex? And where I think I want to invite you to think with me, perhaps as a way to release you on time, is to think about the logic underlying compassionate conservatism, in which a single figure on the evangelical, actually fundamentalist Christian right, namely Marvin Olasky, imbibed, and I hope Professor Patrick Allett is here. No, unfortunately not. Well, his students will recognize his work, of course, here, in which evangelicalism managed to bring Catholic social teaching around subsidiarity, the idea that no function that could be performed at the lowest possible levels, the family, the neighborhood, should then be taken over by the state, and that therefore privatization of what we in the 20th century came to consider government functions was actually in the spiritual interests of everyone practicing them, because removing it from a bloodless bureaucracy and returning it to the lowest level at which it can be provided. I'll go and visit you in prison and we'll pray together, as opposed to Pell Grants will be available for prisoners to continue to study, things like that. That there's actually a spiritual justification for that, that the evangelical right learned from the Catholic social tradition, but by way of thinkers like Michael Novak or Marvin Olasky, who wrote Compassionate Conservatism, and sort of Newt Gingrich popularized this among the Republican Party. So that on a national and then international stage, there's been this closing of the Reformation, conceivably. Conceivably, you could argue something that big, that 500 years of religious antipathy has been healed in some ways by a shared logic of post-industrial political organization, spirituality, sexual conservatism. Of course, the new pope shakes things up. The demands made on human spirits by the post-industrial order of things couldn't help but produce new spiritual formations, I argue. Work, after all, fills most of our waking hours. The organization of labor, both productive labor and reproductive labor, shapes every aspect of existence, from the most intimate subjective experience of emotion and affect to the largest scale operations of power that can reshape a population, a nation, an ecology. Religious regulation of the self, where the immanent and the transcendent meet, where people teach themselves to be good workers at the job of reproduction, at the job of production, at work, is a moment where we can see the intimate actions of your day-to-day life meet your biggest possible concerns and worldviews, right? And a sphere like that, I think, helps us to see the tectonic shifts reshaping us beyond the time horizon of an election cycle or the latest boom and bust. And if for no other reason, I want to argue it merits our thoughtful attention. And I invite you to think with me now about these questions if I can be of use to you in that conversation. Thank you for your patience. I'm also happy to talk about Freedom University if you decide that you've had enough of theology. Sir.
Brian Kessler, University of Mississippi. I'm particularly interested, and I think there's sort of this, what I have termed I'm sure other people have as well, but what I see is sort of a second wave of the evangelical private school movement that happens in the sort of post-segregation academy move, particularly with the rise of the PCA and different things that come along with that. And it's almost a neo-scholasticism in their thought, in the sort of going back to classical education and a lot of different, sort of other ways of, they're not just taking the sort of traditional Dewey model in the education system, but they're actually, basically joining back with what Catholic schools have been doing since they've been in America. And so it's fascinating to me to think of that beyond just this sort of, a theological moment, but in other ways that it's working out. And to me, that connects so well with what's going on in this 60s and 70s and 80s movement of, you get a theological underpinning of the secular government now, we have to keep them out of our schools, and to see that then transitioning as that first and second generation of kids who grew up in private schools are coming to say, oh, well, if we privatized our schools for theological reasons, it makes sense we do the same thing with, the idea of Pell Grants, and instead let's go and sort of, compassionately talk to them and be with them and sort of take them through this and the whole rise of the faith-based initiatives. So that was just a really interesting connection.
I had not known that about the curricula inside evangelical schools. That is fascinating. And allow me to suggest, if you haven't already encountered them, the arguments of, on the one hand, David Sehat, I think right here at Georgia Tech or something, right? Georgia State, yes, even better. This is being recorded. In which he makes, perhaps you know it, but a fantastic argument about the way that established Protestantism, spent the better part of 150, 200 years fighting Catholicism, as we all know, and then sort of when the game was clearly lost in the ninth inning, switching sides and saying, oh, all this government regulation of religion was all about being anti-religion. No, it was all about being Protestant, aggressively Protestant anti-Catholic. But now that the opponent is secular rather than confessional, they've managed to spin that argument. And so it's definitely part of that same rapprochement. But the other book that this puts me in mind of, and that may change your sense of the chronology of this and causality, would be Piety and Public Funding, I think is the title, by, Axel Schaefer, has made a great argument about simply the massive shift of resources out of the public sphere into the faith-based sector through all sorts of mechanisms in the decades immediately after World War II and leading into the Great Society. So the Great Society, which we think of as this massively liberal undertaking, right, was to a great extent a massive federal giveaway to the faith-based sector, for good or ill. That's one of the things that happen, and which has effects in all sorts of privatization mechanisms then subsequently. But that is really fascinating that neo-Thomism is making it now in the evangelical schools. Thank you. Sir?
Yes, I was wondering if you could talk some more about this sort of psychology of debt and Dave Ramsey, and because if he has people call him and shout when they get out of debt. They do these debt-free screams, is what he calls them. But at the same time, if you try to make any sort of structural argument as why you got into debt, he'll hang up on you pretty much. He has no patience whatsoever for any sort of argument that says this bad thing happened in my life, therefore I'm in debt, or this is the way I grew up, therefore this is a problem. So we can talk some more about psychology of that sort of thinking about debt.
Yeah, well, I think it goes back to the conversation we were having earlier in Yale's panel. These three folks right here were part of a terrific panel on post-industrial spirituality and work, and that therapeutic ethos that animates so much of everything from Zen to evangelicalism, I think, where the problem has to be entirely internalized. And of course, we recognize the genealogy of that in Reformed Protestantism, but the intensification of it on every level under a neoliberal moment, if you can stand that terminology, I think gets expressed very clearly in a moment like the ones you're pointing to, where no structural argument, because a structural argument says it's not susceptible to my personal will, it's not susceptible to my self-discipline. I don't have, you can say that structural explanations of inequality or injustice are disempowering if the people that you're talking to do not have a sense of having an ability to change the entire structure, that it's more, in the short run at least, more efficacious and therefore more merciful to talk to people about the things they can change. Because we all could imagine how we could run out tomorrow and completely ruin our futures with a credit card. And so to make your argument around the thing that is susceptible to the individual will and the individual action of self-discipline, I think resonates with people as just a recognition of their personal experience frequently, but also can be really empowering for people on the other end of it, I mean, obviously Ramsey is a political figure as well, and so it's not that totally disinterested, but if we're looking for the places where there can be a meeting of the minds and hearts around very contentious issues, I do think that I cry when I listen to Dave Ramsey, the stories that people call in with, and of course, white women crying, always the symbol of an elevated soul, right? But did you have more thoughts about that? Because I'm wide open to.
I mean, he's a fascinating guy, and I thought to myself, here's somebody who's studying him at a scholarly level. I was just curious as to the psychology of Dave Ramsey.
Well, he's very friendly too. Sir.
Yes. I have a question about the degree to which there's a convergence between evangelicals and business culture around the kind of ethic of the entrepreneur, right? So it's always striking. So it's fascinating to see how you incorporate kind of the service economy and then finance. But to me, you see so many of these mega churches where the ministers themselves talk about borrowing principles of entrepreneurship to build a church. Bill Hybel in Willow Creek, had this story about how he builds that church. He goes out and does market research. What do people not like about church? And then we'll do all the opposite things, right? And And so there's definitely this affinity there, and I wonder if this couldn't be enough. I mean, how would you make sense of that? Is there a way to fit that into the kind of framework that you're developing? And also, it's striking to me, given how much you've said about finance, how much the language of entrepreneurship covers this kind of much more kind of insidious kind of, gambling economy that you're describing.
Because you can be an entrepreneur in anything.
Right.
You can be a drug dealing entrepreneur. You can, entrepreneurship is a container.
It implies a kind of building. I mean, even if you're all you're doing is building your profits within a financial services small, company.
Well, I mean, again, you missed a great chance earlier to hang out with people talking about that, because I think it was Mr. Saunders' paper was referring directly to Colin Campbell's great book on the romantic ethic and the spirit of consumerism, which, as the title obviously states, is trying to offer a different take on the Protestant ethic, that in fact the celebration of profit generation and consumption has its own Christian genealogy as well, and we were talking about the very long roots of that. In the specific moment, though, again, of privatization and of using the term entrepreneur to mean a lot of things, including someone who just lost a secure lifetime job, or someone who's not going to have a crack at a secure lifetime job. Our undergraduates who are told to be entrepreneurs of the self, i.e., hey, no promises, you're on your own, let's see what you can do with it, right? That is, I think, a deeply pernicious, that there was a moment, and there are industries and there are economic niches where entrepreneurship is, in fact, a possibility, but it's always a terrible, terrible bet. In some of the Walmart research, I followed these, there are all these entrepreneurship programs, particularly at Christian universities, colleges, that had to go and woo supporters. When their finances were falling apart in the post-war decades, they figured out that they could kind of market themselves to entrepreneurs for donations on the basis of lionizing entrepreneurship itself. And so if you look around at many small southern or denominational schools, there's an entrepreneurship center, and they'll have an entrepreneur of the year, and they'll have, but then you go along to the literature that sort of followed those, and you get all these professors anonymously filling out these surveys going, yeah, it was a huge disappointment. We'd bring these guys in, and they were just clearly such fools, and nobody was inspired by them, and the best thing that someone could say was, man, if that idiot can do it, surely I can, And that then these entrepreneurship incubators would wind up being colossal failures if you track the people who graduated from them. That what did they want? They wanted a secure job, and the best thing that could happen to them, their biggest success story, was that they created a small company or a product or something that was bought by a large stable place that then gave them a normal job. So I think entrepreneurship is like the bright siding of insecurity for 99 cases out of 100, and then there's a Zuckerberg, who was already at Phillips Exeter and Harvard and was going to land on his feet even if he had failed colossally at what he was doing. So I think entrepreneurship then becomes the myth to cover failure in so many centers. So megachurches, right. Those are great entrepreneurial endeavors for the superstars of them. They are the Googles of the spiritual landscape, but I guess we never hear about the ones that fail colossally. So, but y'all should talk afterwards. Sir.
Hi, I'm Shatan Lee. I'm Emory University history. I don't know if I can relate directly to some of the concerns that you raised, but here are my two quick thoughts, and I'll try to pose them as questions. First and foremost, within the service sector economy, especially in restaurants, there is also a new trend towards producing affect, producing a certain kind of emotional concern with the customer, with the patron, which perhaps in some ways is also premised on masking one's religious proclivity or one's religious belief. I'm thinking in terms of many of the service sector employees who depend on tipping, and given post-2008 where the clientele has really become, the quest to get a patron is so desperate that you are also looking at a diversification of consumer, ethnically, racially, class-wise, so on and so forth. So I was thinking, in that sense, aren't there spaces within service sector economy which are inadvertently becoming workspaces of some sort of secular nature, or if not secular, some sort of suppression of personal religious belief? And secondly, and this is unrelated to the specificities of your paper, but there are certain parts which are now being referred as leisure capitalism, where the real estate boom has taken place, leading to purchase of lands, distribution of some money, but the money actually is not being reinvested into the local economy. And so it leads to like hours of what is called non-productive leisure, but it really works well. And this is being seen in the rise of some of the mega cities in Southeast Asia. And I was thinking, and here again, what is being suppressed is any sort of religious relationship with finance, because it is assumed that any sort of use of that money with religion would break the cycle of leisure capitalism, which in itself is a reflection of ennui, is a reflection of things are good with capitalism. We are getting our money, we don't need to protest, and so on and so forth. So I was thinking, how would you respond to, I don't know if it's an exception.
Well, I mean, I think there's, it's been really interesting to me going around and talking with people who work on similar things and think about these things, that there's a discernible trend across religious adherence of many of the same tropes. I'm thinking of work like Iowa Ong's or Elizabeth Dunn or Dadomir Rudznik, where we're working in completely different religious ecologies, and yet seeing many of these same techniques of micro self-regulation in the name of religion. I mean, when you remember that more than 80% of the world calls itself religious, and of course that covers an enormous spectrum, but still, it's hard to say that there are fully secular readouts when the overwhelming majority of humanity carries some religious tradition into virtually every sphere. So when you think about masking or suppressing religion in certain economic spheres, I'd look for conflict over that. I mean, I'd be really surprised if, I mean, obviously any attempt to engineer affect is going to produce internal conflict, but I'd be really surprised if that were a project that could be carried off on a large scale, whether intentionally or not, without producing major conflict, like things like conscience clauses for pharmacists, right? Or healthcare providers, like, what was that viral YouTube video? Was that a joke? Someone correct me if it was, but where the waitress refuses to serve the gay couple, and then like the whole restaurant rises up and excoriates her for her inhospitality in, but it was a religious objection, obviously, that she didn't feel that she should be called upon to do this, right? So I don't feel that I'm getting at the heart of what you're asking about, but I think it's an interesting place to ponder how increasing diversity might make that increasingly complex and conflict-ridden. Please.
Maybe this is sort of an obvious question, but I would assume that servant leader managers at home are in some sense serving their customers, serving the organization. But why doesn't that translate into serving their subordinates in the sense of like getting benefits?
Well, that would be the big question, right? The $64,000 benefit question. I mean, the argument goes that there's and it's easy for us to think about this, right? Working in a service profession, as most of us, I think, do. I doubt many people wandered in here from the finance sector. That, you know, the university knows its employees, just as Walmart knows its employees back when it had any. They know that we're committed to students, that the emotional payoff, on the one hand, of investing in students and aiding their growth and development, just like why are there not as many strikes among nurses as the conditions of their work would suggest? Why don't all kinds of service workers demand in the way that industrial workers did certain kinds of very concrete material remuneration for their work? Well, in part because they're not working for the man. You know, they're working for the sick patient in the bed. They're working for the student who really, really, really wants to understand the Industrial Revolution and wants to talk to you about it on a Friday night, you know? And who can say no to that, right? So there's the servant leadership idea is, at the very least, you can take the ideal of service, of humble service, which is a very Christian ideal, and hold it up as the pattern for a workplace. And I promise you, if the University of Georgia turned to us tomorrow and said, the most important work that's going on this campus is the work that you are doing investing in your students, we honor that, we celebrate that, how can we get you more paper clips to make that possible? Or, you know, whatever the little payoff would be, it would go a long way for people who, you know, nonetheless are not going to get paid $300,000 administrator salaries, right? So I think it's easy to overstate the irrationality of service laborers who do not somehow manage to pull off this historically unique uprising of industrial labor that briefly won a moment of high benefits, high wages, some stability, some hope for the future for their children. That was an incredibly specific historic moment. It was underwritten by vast numbers of workers who never got any of that, whether they were the wives of the guys in the auto factories or the black men who were last hired and first fired, or the contract workers brought up from Mexico on the Bracero program, right? That was never the norm. It was just one little slice. And the fact that service workers have not been able to accomplish what it took industrial workers 200 years to pull off for about 25 or 30 years only for a minority of workers, I think inverts the question. The real question is, my God, how did they get away with it? How did one entire generation of blue-collar workers send their kids to college at the University of Michigan? You know, that's incredible. And how fast was that dismantled as soon as it could possibly be, right? So in that setting, to be told the work that you do is so valuable, it's so important, it's going to be the foundation of our management philosophy, it's going to be the thing that we talk to the press about, it's going to hang on a banner over the door, you know, beats the alternative, right? And it works on us. You know, look at the graduate students here who are begging to be allowed, right, to work for $18,000 a year doing incredibly labor-intensive service work. Where's the irrationality, right? And if you want to talk about the graduate student labor movement, I'm happy to talk to you over at the reception. I probably overstayed my welcome. Everyone's hungry.
Do you have any final questions?
My mind is just, you have opened up so much for me, but I just feel like maybe Sarah Palin's making sense now to me, maybe some of this.
That's a scary moment in life, isn't it?
Paul Ryan with his wanting to cut Social Security, he lived off Social Security because his father died when he was young. I just feel like I still don't know, though, what you're explaining and how it all seems to come together in such interesting ways, and yet these people are still politically voting for things that hurt them.
But aren't we all? You know, hands in the air if you have recently voted for something that hurt your bottom line, right? We all have ideals.
But yet you also see when Bush tried to privatize Social Security, it didn't happen. I mean, and
Right.
the red states were the places where people really needed that to keep grandma in the nursing home or whatever. But it's just still, I now understand how the language that I hear the right use, where it's tapping in, that I didn't really understand before.
And that's all I think that if you're coming at these questions from a different standpoint that can be asked, is just to at least adopt a subject position for a moment that would allow someone else's logic to at least look logical. You don't have to adopt it, you don't have to buy it, you don't have to ignore the contradictions in it, but it changes political discourse from being two people think each other are utterly irrational, to at least being able to see that, all of us who voted for healthcare reform voted against our own economic interests in the service of what we perceive to be a larger good. Now, someone else's formula of what that looks like could be 180 degrees opposite, but it doesn't mean they're not actually voting. It doesn't mean they're voting irrationally. It means they're voting to support an ideal that may very well hurt their bottom line, but that to them is equally precious,
But I think the left could benefit from understanding what you're explaining.
Well, I'm very grateful to hear that. And if you find them, and if you do that, the profits from the book, from the book, go to the Economic Justice Coalition in Athens and to Interfaith Worker Coalition based in Chicago, which is a national network of people of faith who work for worker justice. So, so do buy the book if you absolutely must.
How does Freedom University, like this other project that has taken so much of your time and energy, fit into this story?
I mean, a better person to answer that if you want to talk about Freedom University is Pamela Vogel, also from UGA and also a founding faculty member, an incredibly powerful force behind Freedom University. I think the answer is it's just another example of, when history knocks on your door, you have to actually respond. As people here probably know, the University System of Georgia kicked out and banned from applying as students any Georgia high school graduates who were undocumented, right? Even if they were going to pay international tuition, which is a massive moneymaker, right? And so these students themselves went and sat down, blocked traffic in front of the State House and demanded that the ban be rolled back and that associated forms of anti-immigrant legislation be rolled back. And when we saw that, we thought, okay, here's people who are in fact risking something very personal for their sense of the greater good, and asked if there was any way we could support them. And their answer, to our surprise, actually was, we want to go to class. And we're like, really? So this is now in its third year of leading college class on Sunday for undocumented students who are not permitted by the state of Georgia to apply to the University of Georgia, Georgia State, any of several other competitive campuses. They are continuing to push for a change of the legislation and the ban, and they are an incredibly inspirational bunch of people who are risking far more than any of us in this room have skin to put in the game. So if there's a way that you want to contribute to that, you are more than welcome to help buy books, help us drive students who often cannot legally drive to get to class, and we're happy to talk to you about that as well.